Welcome back, everyone. So for those of you who just joined us, I'm still Alyssa Goodman, co-director of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study here for Science. And we're in the middle of our program about next in data visualization. And I'm pleased to say that we ran out of handouts in the back, and so several of you have asked for more. They're being printed. And the glue handout was especially popular, and yes, it is an open source project, and it's a collaboration that started here at Harvard, and Michelle or I would be happy to tell you more about it later. So to move on to our next speaker, the next speaker is Danielle Albers Szafir, who is an assistant professor of information science and an affiliate professor of computer and cognitive science at the University of Colorado at Boulder. See, I told you we would go farther than Cambridge and Boston. She's going to talk to us about driving exploratory visualization through perception and cognition. So just to clarify what that means, you've heard two people, and I, in the last hour and a half, talk about, oh, Danielle's going to explain that, Danielle's going to explain that. And what we were saying had to do all with perception and cognition. And so that's the kind of how do humans appreciate these visualizations? What do our brains, our cognitive systems, and our eyes allow us to perceive? And not only that, but how do they deceive us? And so I don't know how much of that Danielle's going to talk about, but I'm very much looking forward to her talk. And before I just turn over the floor to her, let me tell you that she got her undergraduate degree in computer science at the University of Washington in 2009, and then she went on to a PhD at the University of Wisconsin, also in computer science, also in a visual computing group there. And I also want to know what she's going to say, if anything, about interactive machine learning, which she says is one of her interests that we sort of almost heard about in the previous talk. So anyway, let's move on to Danielle, and we can all hear what she has to say. Thank you, Danielle.
All right, so thank you so much for the introduction. Unfortunately, today, I'm not going to touch on the interactive ML stuff too much, but I'm happy to chat with people offline about that, because there's some really interesting and engaging questions, as we saw in Arvind's talk. But as we've also seen, visualization is a fundamentally interdisciplinary field. Much of Viz is focusing on how we provide insight into data from other fields. And this is a fundamental component of Viz. It's why we as developers do what we do. But I want to build on some of the work mentioned by Michelle and Arvind to focus on a different kind of interdisciplinarity. How can we develop fundamental models of how people perceive visualized data to drive more effective tools for all domains? So I explore how we can leverage the brain's ability to make sense of visual information to design novel visualization tools for interactive exploratory data analysis. So you can see a subset of these projects here. And with a fantastic group of students, I work with stakeholders and analysts in domains ranging from literary scholarship to biology to emergency response to make sense of their data and guide more effective and efficient decision making. When we design these systems, we're not only dealing with the problem of big data that we've all heard about, but we're also seeing challenges in terms of data variety and complexity. New people are looking to leverage data, and the growth of people with analysis needs is far outpacing the growth of people with analysis skills. We're also developing new techniques that bring together data from different sources to enrich our perspectives. In bringing new people and new data forward, we also consequently raise new questions to be asked of our data. Now, some of you guys might be thinking, so what? Why can't we just compute the right answer and not worry about any of this? Well, the answer here is pretty simple. We don't always know what we're looking for. So I'm going to ask for a little audience participation a few times throughout this talk, and the first time is right here. So I have 4 data sets with first-order statistics. So would you say these distributions are fairly similar? Some of you might be thinking I'm probably messing with you, or I wouldn't be asking this question. So these data sets all have the same first-order statistics, but when I actually look at their underlying structure, they have qualitatively very different patterns and shapes, and we can see that immediately here. We've worked to describe how this data behaves, and we really understand the differences between these data sets, but we might not be able to readily enumerate them. So how do we get insights using visualizations that we can't with statistics? Let's focus on just these 2 scatterplots here to try to explain this. So the process of interpreting data happens over time. It starts with our sense of sight. Light from the red and the orange points goes into the eye and essentially fires off a set of processes and signals to start interpreting that information. At the end of these processes, we reach the far side of this spectrum, which is insights. That's the knowledge we generate with these visualizations. For example, one insight we might infer from this data is that while these data sets have identical statistics, they have qualitatively different shapes that we can describe as linear and as parabolic. But how do we get from our sense of sight to insight? From the structures and patterns we see here to knowledge, what comes in between? Well, by understanding the perceptual and cognitive processes that occur between sight and insight, we can start to understand how the ways we visualize data determine the knowledge that people are able to infer from this data. I'm going to talk about 3 lines of work today that seek to fill in this knowledge space. So the first looks at how we can accurately translate pixels into data. The second is looking at how the ways we represent data are going to shift the kinds of patterns that we might see. And the third looks at how visualizations actually influence the perceived reliability of the conclusions that we draw. So let's start by just looking at how do we actually read data. And I'm going to focus in particular on reading data encoded using color. So visualization has historically used CIELAB rather than RGB as a space to map data to colors. For the purposes of this talk, all you need to understand is that lab consists of 3 axes that mimic cells in the eye, and it's popular for visualization as it's what we call approximately perceptually linear. That is, 1 unit of Euclidean distance in this space approximately corresponds to a 50% just noticeable difference, which is the smallest color difference that people can reliably distinguish. CIELAB gives us a 1-to-1 mapping between our data differences and color differences that's critical for analysis, but in practice, it fails miserably. And let me show you how. So CIELAB states that we should be able to see 7 different color categories in this bar chart. As you can probably see, this expectation doesn't really pan out. And visualization designers have hand-tuned color sets for data representation using decades of experience to employ these models as heuristics in crafting better encodings, essentially using their skills and their intuitions. However, even these encodings can start to break down as we change the size of our marks, or even as we change the kinds of visualizations that we're using. So in encodings, we want to try to balance discriminability, which is the ability to see important data differences, with the range of desired data differences we need to encode. So how do we do this? Well, if we have a scatter plot like the one I'm showing you here, we want to maintain color differences across important ranges of our data. Even as the size of our marks change, we want to be able to still see these differences. And the previous example shows that these differences start to disappear as our marks get smaller. But what if we could instead increase the differences between our mark colors to preserve these key differences in our data? Rather than relying on manual estimation, what we wanted to do was create quantitative metrics that would allow for us to account for changes in mark size and even visualization type to ensure that our visualizations show the features in our data that designers need them to, and also to ensure that people can actually accurately interpret this data. So to do this, we created a data-driven method to proactively anticipate how color difference perceptions change as a function of the visualizations that we use. We developed 3 different models using this approach. The first focusing on what we call diagonally symmetric marks. These are things like points you would see in a scatter plot. The second looked at elongated marks, like what we would use in a bar chart. And the third looked at what we call asymmetric elongated marks, which are similar to what we would see in a line graph. And we collected the data for these models using a really simple approach. So people essentially saw a series of visualizations like this scatter plot, and we asked them to compare color-coded values of the 2 colorful marks. Then all we had to do was measure how often they correctly detected a difference between any 2 marks to try to compute metrics for each visualization type. So I'm going to start by showing you what we found in scatter plots. There's some math involved in these models that I'm just going to kind of skip over for the sake of time. I'm happy to talk about that offline. But this plot is going to show our traditional results for a 50% just noticeable difference, where the size of my scatter plots is along the x-axis. So higher values on the y-axis mean that the data will be harder to discriminate. It'll be harder to figure out where those differences are. So for scatter plots, CIELAB, our traditional color space, would predict our just noticeable difference at the level indicated by this line. And here are actually our results. So what we see here is that conventional models vastly underestimate our ability to distinguish data encoded using color, and that this discriminability varies inversely with mark size. That is, as our marks get smaller, we may no longer be able to see a difference in our data. So to just give a summary of what we found here, the true perceived data difference in scatter plots is about 7 times smaller than that we predict with traditional models. And this difference gets worse as our marks get smaller. Adding in additional information reflecting typical visualizations makes it even harder to discriminate between these values. But all of these points have a uniform shape. In practice, our example shows that elongating these marks actually increases our abilities to determine data differences in color encodings, but we don't know by how much. However, one of the challenges here is that elongated geometries vary along 2 dimensions. We have length and we have thickness. So to address this, we tested a series of bars at fixed thicknesses and variable lengths. Jumping to the results again, here the dashed lines correspond to our point metrics from scatter plots. The x-axis corresponds to mark thickness, and the size of a point corresponds to mark length, with thicker points reflecting longer bars. What we find here is that generally speaking, making marks longer increases our abilities to discriminate color encodings. However, these gains appear to be asymptotic, as seen by the fact that the points tend to cluster as we move along the x-axis. We can generate reliable models of these difference perceptions using thickness, but this might actually underestimate people's abilities to discriminate data for these kinds of graphs. So we instead look more deeply into the size gains, and we found that elongation, which is the ratio of the longest and shortest edge, best explains the gains that we saw from these marks, with these gains leveling off asymptotically at about a 2-to-1 ratio. So the takeaways from this are the dimensions of marks in our visualization shift perceived data differences, with longer marks allowing us to see more differences in our data. However, the gains of these models appear to be asymptotic. At some point, making bars longer no longer helps. We can test this theory by looking at line graphs, where we can control how thick a line is, but these marks tend to be much, much longer than they are thick. Comparing again against our scatter plot metrics, which are indicated here with the dashed lines, we found that discriminability on asymmetric line marks varied inversely with line thickness, and that we again saw significantly greater discriminability compared to scatter plots. And to give you a more concrete sense of what I mean, by building models that were explicitly tailored to line graphs rather than just repurposing our scatter plot models, we regain about 25 to 30% of our encoding space. So we can encode a lot more data than we might otherwise be able to. So this model shows that encoding perceptions vary inversely with thickness. And again, that these scatter plot metrics are too conservative to capture this variance. Given that lines are generally far more narrow than points, this means that we can make significantly better use of our encoding space by using a metric directly tailored to our marked geometries. And collectively, what we see is that our ability to discriminate color in visualizations varies as a function of the visualization that we're using. So just noticeable differences vary according to size and shape, but some of these gains tend to be asymptotic. The reason why we should care about this is these are actually pretty dramatic shifts in what we expect people to be able to see in their data. So mapping our data to our scatter plots, we lose about 70% of our encoding space, but then by tailoring those encodings to the kinds of visualizations we use, we can gain about 25 to 30% of that loss back. So the changes that we're seeing in interpreting data as mark size change are an example of a failure in what we call separability. So separability at its simplest is the premise that if I encode data in one dimension like color, people can accurately interpret data along that dimension regardless of other dimensions like size. So the basic idea here is that if I have multidimensional data, using different channels that are separable to encode that data shouldn't interfere with my ability to interpret information in my visualizations. Color, size, and shape have historically been considered separable, which is why popular tools like Tableau use them for multidimensional data sets. But we've just seen a breakdown in the separability for color and size. Smaller points are harder to distinguish, and aspects of geometry can influence these differences. What happens when we vary shape more extensively? Well, we ran a series of 4 studies looking at interactions between color, shape, and size. And for time, I'm just going to focus on 2 of these, measuring how shape changes perceived color and how color changes perceived shape. So we use the same methodology as before, where we show people scatter plots like these and ask them to compare the 2 colorful points. We looked at 16 different shapes used in common visualization tools. And if separability holds, we should see equal color differences across all of these shapes. If we look to vision science, we might actually hypothesize that the number of pixels might correspond to our discriminability levels. So we may see a ranked order, kind of like what we see up here from left to right, with more differences being visible for marks on the left and fewer visible on the right. What we actually found was this. So the number of differences visible for each shape varied dramatically from our predictions, with green lines showing shapes that did better than we expected, and red showing those that did worse. And we can find some interesting differences here. For example, we found that people were really good at discriminating values on these plus signs, and that when we have filled stars, people were actually less able to do those comparison tasks than if we had outline stars. Sparse open shapes actually exhibited absolutely no predictable patterns. The takeaway that we have here is that color, shape, and size are not separable. But these failures are not necessarily well explained by conventional hypotheses. So instead, using empirically derived models rather than our intuition can actually provide the best way to predict and account for variations in perceptions in data viz. We also want to flip things around a little bit and look at how the color of a mark influences people's abilities to estimate its shape. So here, the x-axis encodes color, and the y-axis shows how well people could identify shapes for marks of a different color. And the fact that we have a flat line here essentially means that we're seeing an asymmetry in our ability to distinguish between these different features in our data. What we see is that shape is separable from color, but color is not separable from shape. So the takeaway here is that modeling how we read visualized data can actually help us to identify and account for potential biases in visualizations that are introduced by interactions between different dimensions of a data set. We can actually use these models to predict and correct for these errors in practice, and I'd be happy to talk about some systems that we've been building to do this offline. But right now what I want to do is I want to move on from these very simple comparisons and ask what happens when we want to make more complex kinds of judgments. Well, we have a limited number of channels for encoding data, things like position, size, and color. Some of the foundational research regarding how accurately these channels communicate information was done by Cleveland and McGill in 1984. And they essentially showed people two values like we see here, and they asked a simple question: how much bigger is A than B? Based on their responses, Cleveland and McGill were able to generate a ranking from the most to least effective ways of representing data. Now, conventional visualization uses this ranking to prioritize what properties of a data set we should map to which channels. One challenge with these results is that effective here means understanding relative values. So Zaks and Tversky in '99 showed people two-value graphs once again, but they asked them to describe what they saw. When shown a bar chart, people would say something along the lines of, B is bigger than A. But when they were shown a line graph, people would say, oh, the values are increasing. And the key takeaway here is that the way we represent data actually changes the intuitive patterns people see in that data and the questions that they might want to ask. So what happens in today's world where we have terabyte-plus data sets? Things get even more complicated when we start to look at these higher-level statistics. So pay close attention to the cross here. I'm going to really quickly show you a scatter plot I want you to analyze. All right, everybody ready? All right, now which point was in the plot? How many of you guys would say point A? How many of you guys would say point B? All right, so what you're seeing here is the vast majority of you guys feel like it was point B. In practice, it was actually point A. This is an example of a phenomenon popularized by Ariely in 2001 called ensemble coding. The basic idea is that our brain is actually capable of very, very quickly estimating aggregate statistics about visual data, such as the average size of points in our scatter plot. And we can do that at just a glance. So if we consider all of these studies together, this suggests that the ways we visualize data change the questions that we can answer. So how do we manage all of these different guidelines? Well, one option is to show all of your relevant statistics. Here we can see the range, variance, mean, and outliers of this data set. As you can see, this isn't really working, right? There's just too much here. So to derive more grounded guidance into what we might be able to do to support different kinds of analysis tasks, we constructed an experiment where we looked at 6 different statistical tasks, and we asked people to complete these tasks with 8 different time series visualizations. So rather than go through all of the infrastructure and everything, I'm just going to show you a quick example of what we found. So here I've got a line graph of daily sales totals for a year. Which month would you say has the highest individual sales day? Just feel free to shout it out. May, all right? Hopefully this wasn't too bad. All right, let's change the question up a little bit. What if I asked what month has the highest sales on average? Yes, there we go. We got the right answer, March. So as you can probably see, this was a little bit harder than the last question. Well, what if I change up my visualization? Here it mapped data value to color. The darker the color, the higher the value. So which month here would you say has the highest average sales? March, right? So hopefully this was a little easier than last time. But what if I change this up one more time and I say, what month has the highest individual sales day? Yep. People perform more or less a chance at this. This is pretty much impossible to do. But the answer is May, because these are actually, in fact, the same data set. So here what we can see is that there are trade-offs in the different data representations we're able to use. And we're able to use experimental data to compute what these trade-offs are and understand more deeply how different visualizations might support different kinds of tasks. And in particular, what we found was that position methods, which Cleveland and McGill and other studies tell us should be really, really precise, are great for asking questions about individual values. But color, which we historically think of as not so strong, is actually fantastic for estimating these higher level aggregate statistics. So to this end, what we did is we went through the vision science literature to try to understand what do we actually know about these higher level statistical tasks. We were able to break down insights from vision science to identify 4 different high level tasks people might want to conduct. So the first is finding interesting values. The second is computing aggregate statistics. The third is finding different interesting groups of points. And the last was looking at different structures and patterns we might see within that data. So we can actually turn to results from vision science to try to understand exactly what is going on in our visualization and how we might make it better. The general takeaway is that the ways that we choose to represent data actually change the patterns that we see, and therefore the kinds of conclusions we can draw from our data. We can use this knowledge and the knowledge of the subsequent trade-offs in representations to try to actually create visualizations that are better tailored to suit particular data in different domains. So all of these results so far have focused on reading quantities from viz, but there are qualitative components to viz that are not captured by these results that occur when we try to translate the values that we read into knowledge. So these components influence the decisions and conclusions we might draw from our data. For example, we typically think of data as complete and error-free, and we see these data sets as highly trustworthy and reliable. However, I'm sure many of you guys have gotten data sets that are much closer to this, right? We have lots of missing data. Real data sets, they're messy, they're imperfect, and this imperfection can inhibit how we do visualization analysis and how we interpret the results of that analysis. So working with data like this raises a question of how should we actually deal with missing values in visualization? And how do the methods we use to do so influence data interpretation? For example, should we highlight those errors and say, let's map them to red so we know that there's an error here when communicating there's something bad? Should we downplay these errors? Should we do something completely different? Well, we ran an experiment to explore how the ways we choose to estimate and represent values for missing data actually shift our perceptions of data and the conclusions that we draw from it. And we typically deal with these values by estimating a number to replace each missing value and indicating that value explicitly in our viz. So we looked at how existing systems do this, and we found 2 primary factors. The first is how we choose to represent our value. So these are viz techniques. And the second is how we choose to estimate that value. So that's going to be our imputation method. And just to kind of cut to the chase here, there were 4 different visualization methods that people use. So make our missing values really salient, make them not very salient, kind of fade them into the background, give us some sense of the statistical error of our estimate, and also just remove those values entirely. And we can estimate these values by doing simple things like filling in zeros, which is super common in most popular tools, looking at the mean value of the data that we actually have, or even doing something a little more sophisticated and trying to do an actual interpolation of those values. So when we ask people questions about their data, like how confident are you in your data? How credible is the data? How complete is it? How reliable is it? What we found is that people find visualizations like those in the top row to be highly credible and highly reliable, and those in the bottom row to be much less credible and much less reliable, even for the same data. So one of the patterns that we observed here is that all of those visualizations at the top generally preserve the relative structure of our data, whereas these visualizations at the bottom either remove the values or make them much, much less salient. Well, we tend to group values into local clusters. And all these visualizations at the bottom lend themselves to this kind of grouping. So our hypothesis here is that if we actually use representations for missing data that break the structure that we see in our viz, people are going to be less confident in that data. Whereas if we use something like up top, where we have a complete visualization and we don't actually interrupt the structure in any way, people tend to see these data sets as highly reliable and tend to be very confident in their conclusions. So what we see here is that the structure of our visualization actually shifts the way that we interpret the conclusions that we draw from that data. So we can actually make people artificially more confident in their data and in their conclusions by making these missing values bright red and saying, hey, there's an error here. And subsequently, we can also overly reduce people's confidence in their data by just removing those values entirely. So by understanding how these different factors work together, we can actually introduce an appropriate amount of skepticism into the conclusions people draw with messy data. So just to kind of wrap up here, I've talked about 3 studies that try to fill this gap between sight and insight. First, looking at how do we actually read values? The second, looking at how do we estimate statistics? And the third, looking at how do our visualizations shift how we feel about our data? We can use these models to try to inform more effective design that's better tailored to the kinds of questions that people want to ask. So with that, I want to wrap up here. I want to thank you all for coming and listening today. I'd like to thank my funding source and my collaborators. I'd also like to thank Radcliffe for having me out. I look forward to the discussion and be happy to take questions.
Great. I think we're going to take one quick question, and the discussion's going to be very soon, so save those for then. Okay.
So thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I'm very excited that you did all the human studies of all these things that we always wonder in making our graphs. And I think it's interesting that the sort of most optimal order is not so different from the default sort of symbol and fill order in signal plot. So my question is, did you break down the group that was giving you the feedback with some kind of demographic data? So for instance, like we are in our Western world, we'll read the time axis from left to right because that's how our language works. But if you're Chinese, you would read, your preference might be in a different order.
Right.
And with visual acuity, so you've used words like, well, people said this, people said that, but were you able to, say, find any differences among subgroups?
So we were unfortunately constrained to US participants by our IRB, so we weren't allowed to necessarily reach out of the country for this particular study, but it would be interesting to follow up on that. And one study in particular that comes to mind as you bring this up is that I think Michelle mentioned earlier this idea of pop out, right? If I have a red scatter plot point amongst a bunch of blues, that tends to pop out really well, right? Pop-out effects actually vary culture to culture. So Japanese cultures, for example, this was some work done by the Rensick Lab out of UBC, Japanese cultures are not necessarily as sensible to conventional pop-out mechanisms. So what we see is that there are some variations in the way that we interpret and we see these perceptual phenomena come to light in vision science that vary across cultures. It's not something we've looked at so far in visualizations, but it would be really interesting to see.
So just your findings were basically independent of the position of along the A and B axes in CIELAB? Like, could you basically do a rotation in the AB plane and get the same distinguishing?
Yeah, so what we find, so one of the things I kind of glossed over here is that we used lots and lots of different people's machines, right? And so visualization viewing varies a lot, right? If you walk outside with your cell phone, it becomes all of a sudden a lot harder to read what was on the screen. So we have all of these factors that can actually influence our perceptions of what happens in our color space. And when we actually look at this color space differencing in a very controlled environment, like a laboratory environment, we can start to see fine-grained differences across the color space. But we did some additional work that I didn't talk about here, where we found that in practice, once you introduce all that craziness from viewing things in the real world, most of those variations actually go away. So then you could do that rotation that you're talking about. So it has to do with the applied side of things versus understanding what's really going on with human vision, and there are some differences there. But in practice for viz, this tends to be pretty robust. Thanks.